and reaping reward 7. Here they come into the stretch. 3/16 of a mile to go. The crowd is screaming. They're in the final 16.
There were 3 sports in America in the 1930s. There was boxing, there was baseball, and there was horse racing.
On the outside. He's drawing away. He's an easy winner. And here comes the finish.
Horse racing has quite an ancient history for our republic. It had done pretty well in the early years of the 20th century. Then it was banned almost everywhere. And it was brought back in the Depression as a way to raise money for desperately depleted state coffers. Wagering was taxed. And that's when it really exploded.
We want to go back in time. I think it's part of human nature. Most every child's fairy tale begins with once upon a time long, long ago. And very often, of course, once upon a time long, long ago was not an easy time. The Depression is complicated, and more complicated than it appears on the surface. It was a failure on the stock market, to be sure, but it was also a failure brought on by overproduction and by lack of government participation in the economy that we have grown accustomed to today. And thousands of people were out of work, a quarter of the population out of work. A great part of the country was on the road, living in their automobiles. There were places in America where people were starving to death. In Kentucky, people were eating weeds to stay alive.
People were desperate for underdog heroes, something that looked like America itself. And along comes this horse that is as beat up as the country is.
I'm not afraid of you.
Seabiscuit was the most written about public figure in America in 1938 by newspaper column inches. Roosevelt was second, Hitler was third.
Holy cow.
This was a star that emerged, but he also became a folk hero because people who were down on their luck, who were written off as losers just the way he was, suddenly found hope or inspiration or a horse they could ride, right? And that's what happened.
Seabiscuit performing in the Massachusetts Handicap. You're seeing how the 5-year-old grandson of Man of War has become top money winner of his time.
Seabiscuit is the son of a rather well-known horse named Hardtack, who was a son of a very, very famous racehorse named Man of War.
Then there was Man of War, one of the great race horses of all time.
Man of War may have been the most extraordinary racehorse who ever lived. He was a freak. He was only beaten once in a 21 race career. He had a lordly, imperious, difficult temper. His trainer once said of him, he was hell to break, a headache to handle, and a catapult to ride.
Man of War was owned by Mr. Riddle, who actually ended up owning War Admiral, who was the nemesis of Seabiscuit ultimately in the match race. Seabiscuit is a distant cousin of War Admiral. He's sort of Cinderella, if you will, at the ball, you know. He's the black sheep of the family.
Seabiscuit was not like his forebears. He looked and acted nothing like Man of War, which was a great disappointment to everyone.
He didn't look like a racehorse. His legs were somewhat odd. He had none of the traditional markings of a champion.
Get rid of him.
He was very small, and so he was written off at birth. They decided that the horse was too puny, too scrawny to run, and because of that, never really gave him a chance. So Seabiscuit was a really terrible horse by the time he was already 4. He was running in what's called the claiming races, where every horse in the race is for sale. It's the lowest rung of the horse racing ladder. He was entered in 3 cheap claiming races a week. I mean, this horse was abused in how hard he was run, and they just tried to squeeze as much cash as they possibly could from the horse, so he never had a chance to show his potential.
Isolator and Regal Lily lead the way as they splash for home. Never rated for mud, Seabiscuit makes a game bid in vain.
He was terrible. His first 17 starts he lost. When he ran, he would swing one foreleg out wildly to the side like he was swatting flies. The great-grandson of the owner said to me, "You can always recognize Seabiscuit in the films because he's the only one that doesn't look like a thoroughbred." He just didn't look the part, but you cannot see a horse's heart by looking at its frame.
That's a very American idea, that hidden inside you is huge potential that's untapped and undiscovered. And if only people had the understanding to explore it or to nurture it a little bit, what could possibly emerge? Damn. What happens if you give somebody a second chance?
Howard and his trainer look Seabiscuit over. Both are thrilled and excited. Here is the horse they have been looking for. Howard immediately contacted the Wheatley stable representative, and the price agreed upon was $8,000.
3 men, all of whom are broken for their own individual reasons, find hope in one another and in this horse. Red Pollard, who was abandoned at a racetrack at the age of 15. Charles Howard, who lost a son and was mired in his own grief. Tom Smith, who lost the West and was displaced from who he was. All of these people had immense obstacles coming in, and they form a unit, they form a bond, they form a team.
This is about talent, and talent comes in all shapes and forms. The talent of the horse, to be sure, but it took the talent of those people who were handling that horse to bring that into focus and make it work.
The great Seabiscuit's running today, and turf-minded Hollywood is here for the big event. Trust Bing Crosby and the movie stars to be on hand.
People really became enamored with Seabiscuit because when this horse emerged and started winning races and just raced constantly, week after week, it seemed like, he developed quite a following.
Well, I'm glad they finally have racing in California. Do they use Western saddles out there?
Well, racing's always had rivalries between the East and West. And back then, the East really was better.
The East Coast was where the Triple Crown winners had all come from. This is where the high-class racing was, and people thought of California racing as being a big step down. Sooner or later, there was going to be a collision between a great Western horse and a great Eastern horse, and it happened with Seabiscuit and War Admiral.
All Turfdom wants to know if Seabiscuit here can beat the great War Admiral. New York racing tycoons propose to stake a $100,000 championship match to find out.
40 million people were listening on the radio. That was 1 out of every 3 Americans.
The flag on the clubhouse turn. Who will be into it first? It's Seabiscuit hitting the turn first and driving for the backstretch.
FDR, the president, was one of those 40 million people who actually put his ear up to the radio and listened to Clem McCarthy's famous call of Seabiscuit drawing away in the stretch.
Seabiscuit, champion racehorse, another famous finisher.
There were 2 great quests of Seabiscuit's career. One was to conquer War Admiral, and the other was to win the Santa Anita Handicap.
Seabiscuit, world's second greatest money winner, points for the big Santa Anita races. Twice he's lost the $100,000 handicap by a nose. Now if those valuable pins can stand the gaff today, he'll try again.
He was coming back at age 7, which is the equivalent of your early 40s, an equine athlete. He was going to be facing horses who were 3 years old and at the peak of their careers.
And here's the big test, and the crowd wonders, can Seabiscuit hold his own? Will the old leg injury check his winning stride? And suddenly seems to falter, and then the Biscuit takes command. And boy, look at him travel. The old campaigner shakes it all off and rolls home, setting a new track record.
He ran the 2nd fastest mile and a quarter ever run in American racing history and set a track record at Santa Anita. At 7 years old. The record stood for 10 years.
Champ of them all, Seabiscuit's one of the all-time greats in the racing world.
Certainly the horse was the centerpiece of it, and There were plenty of people who could tell you everything about the horse who didn't know anything about the people around him. Red Pollard, though, his accidents were very public. They were very heavily covered. Red was actually declared dead after one fall. The life as a jockey in the 1930s was almost unthinkable. It amazes me that people wanted to do it. First of all, you had to starve yourself. You had to weigh as little as 100 pounds. At the absolute most, you could weigh 114 pounds, but you had to be one of the top jockeys to weigh that much.
I don't know, you still look pretty tall to be a jock.
I've never been over 115.
And they did terrible things to their bodies to lose weight. Red Pollard apparently swallowed tapeworms so that he could lose weight. They would desiccate themselves. They hardly ever drank water. That part of it was very bad. The danger was even worse. Between 1935 and 1939, 19 jockeys were killed on the racetrack. The tracks didn't take care of them when they went down on the track. They would be carried up and dumped on a saddle table, even if they were dying. It was a very, very hard life.
The life of the average jockey today is still a pretty rough life. You know, it's a very dangerous sport that we participate in. There are 35 accidents a week that happen to jockeys.
How many sports are you actually risking death? It's like, yeah, you hear about football players breaking this or that and playing through pain, but as a jockey, they're out there risking their lives every time they run.
I think the experience of wedding your mind to the body of an animal that can run sustained speeds of 45 miles an hour is such an enthralling experience that they're willing to torture themselves almost to death to do it.
When you go out there on the race kit,
Very little about horse racing changes. It's a very tradition-bound sport. Racetracks look different because while they were built to accommodate these huge crowds that came to the races in Seabiscuit's era, they don't generally draw crowds like that except at the really big races now. There's off-track betting, there's simulcasting, which spreads your audience out. So the sport is healthy in terms of the finances, but it does look different now.
We have been extremely inventive, almost preoccupied at times with our machines. Nature has to it a kind of spirit or mystery which we don't quite understand. And it's the horse that touches something in the human spirit in a way no machine ever can.
The real horse, Seabiscuit, comes along once in a century. You know, the horse took off as a folk hero that ended up meaning much more than just any particular horse race. It's also a classic underdog story. It's flawed human beings helping one another through their flaws, struggling against the odds. And struggle is an easy thing for people to understand.